In the summer of 1838, in Crawford County, Arkansas, a baby boy cried for the first time. His name was Bass Reeves. He didn't know it yet, but the world he was born into was one of chains, pain, and injustice. He was born a slave, owned by a white farmer named William Steele Reeves, a man of wealth, politics, and power. From the moment Bass opened his eyes, he was not seen as a child, but as property. He had no freedom, no future, and no right to his own name. But inside that small boy lived a quiet strength, a spirit that would one day shake the Wild West itself. Growing up on the Reeves plantation, Bass learned early what hard work meant. He tended the fields, cared for animals, and obeyed every order. From sunrise to sunset, his life belonged to someone else. But Bass wasn't like the others. Even as a child, people noticed something different. He had a sharp mind, a strong body, and eyes that missed nothing. He could track animals, read signs in the dirt, and sense danger before it arrived. Those skills would later make him one of the greatest lawmen in American history. When Bass was a teenager, the country around him began to boil with conflict. The United States was divided, North against South, and talk of war filled every corner. By the early 1860s, the Civil War had begun. The South fought to keep slavery alive. The North fought to end it. Bass, still enslaved, had no choice. He was forced to go to war, not as a soldier for freedom, but as a servant to his master's son, George Reeves, who became a Confederate officer. Bass cared for George's horses, cleaned his weapons, and cooked his meals as battles raged all around them. Imagine it, a man fighting to keep you enslaved, and you're the one keeping him alive. That was Bass Reeves's reality. As the war dragged on, life grew darker and more dangerous. The world was changing fast, but Bass's chains still held tight. Until one day, something snapped. Stories differ on how it happened. Some say Bass and George got into a violent argument over a card game. Others say Bass was beaten or insulted one time too many. Whatever the truth, that night Bass made a decision that would change his life forever. Under the cover of darkness, he fought back, and then ran. He didn't just run away from a man. He ran from slavery itself. Bass Reeves disappeared into the wilderness, chased by dogs, soldiers, and fear. Every step could have been his last. If caught, he would be whipped, branded, or killed. But Bass kept running. Through the woods, through rivers, across miles of untamed land. He ran until his body could barely move. And when he thought all was lost, he reached a land few dared to enter. The Indian Territory, a vast and dangerous region that would one day become Oklahoma. This was not a land for the weak. It was wild, filled with storms, wild animals, and native tribes who trusted no strangers. But Bass wasn't afraid. He was finally free, and he was determined to survive. For the first time, Bass Reeves learned what it meant to live on his own terms. He was taken in by members of the Cherokee and Creek nations, who taught him how to hunt, track, and survive off the land. He learned their languages and their ways. He became one of them, a frontier man, skilled with a rifle and unbreakable in spirit. Years passed. The boy who had once been chained in Arkansas had become something new, a free man with a warrior's heart. Bass lived among the native tribes for years. He became known for his calm nature, his honesty, and his ability to shoot with perfect aim. He could ride for days without rest, follow a trail no one else could see, and disappear into the woods like a ghost. Freedom had changed him. He was no longer the boy who worked the fields. He was a man of the frontier, strong, skilled, and silent. But the world around him was changing again. The war had ended. Slavery was finally abolished. America was rebuilding, but the frontier was still lawless, violent, and wild, and fate was about to call Bass Reeves to something greater. He didn't know it yet, but his past, the pain, the struggle, the fight for freedom, had prepared him for his destiny. The runaway slave was about to become the lawman who would tame the Wild West. In the years ahead, he would arrest thousands of outlaws, bring justice to a land with none, and become one of the most respected U.S. Marshals in history. But for now, Bass Reeves sat beneath the stars of Indian Territory, looking out over the endless plains. He had no idea that one day his name would be spoken with awe, that his story would echo for centuries. All he knew was that he was finally free. And for the first time in his life, That was enough. Bass Reeves had escaped. But freedom was not safety. The night he fled his master's camp, the world turned against him. He had nothing. No food, no map, no protection, only the will to live. Behind him were dogs, soldiers, and men on horseback. They wanted to catch him, to make an example of him. Every tree, every sound in the dark could mean death, but Bass was determined. For the first time in his life, his choices were his own. He crossed rivers and crawled through thick forests, sleeping in mud and eating wild berries. The cold nights bit into his skin, and the sun burned him by day, but he kept moving. His heart told him that freedom was worth any pain. Days turned into weeks. His clothes were torn, his feet bled, and his body was weak. Still, he pushed forward until he reached the edge of the known world, a place called the Indian Territory. It was a wild land filled with danger, but also opportunity. Few white men dared to go there, and that meant safety for a runaway slave. Here, Bass found people who did not judge him by the color of his skin. The Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole tribes took him in. They saw his strength, his intelligence, and his honesty. Among them, Bass began a new life. He learned their languages and studied their ways of living. They taught him to hunt quietly, track footprints, and read the signs of nature. He learned how to move silently through forests, how to sense storms before they came, and how to defend himself against wild animals and men alike. Over time, Bass became more than a survivor. He became a true frontiersman. Living with the tribes changed him deeply. For the first time, he was treated as an equal. Around their fires, he listened to stories of honor, courage, and justice. Those stories took root in his heart. They shaped the kind of man he would become, a man who believed that right and wrong were not decided by skin, but by actions. Years passed. Bass married, built a small home, and began to earn a living as a farmer and tracker. His skills were unmatched. If an animal left tracks in the dirt, Bass could tell its weight, how long it had passed, and even if it was wounded. If someone was lost, Bass could find them. Word of his talent spread quietly across the region. Then, in 1865, the Civil War ended. Slavery was over, at least by law. Bass Reeves was a free man, not just in spirit, but in the eyes of the country. Still, the world around him was far from peaceful. The Indian Territory and nearby regions were filled with violence. Outlaws, thieves, and killers roamed freely. The government struggled to bring order to the vast western lands. That chaos was about to bring Bass Reeves his true calling. In 1875, a new federal judge named Isaac C. Parker took charge of the Western District of Arkansas. He was known as the Hanging Judge, a man determined to bring justice to a place that had none. To do this, he needed brave men who could survive the frontier, hunt down dangerous criminals, and enforce the law across thousands of wild miles. Judge Parker ordered the formation of a group of deputy U.S. Marshals. These were not ordinary officers. Their mission was to capture outlaws in the most violent territory in the nation, the same place Bass once hid for his life. When Parker's men searched for the right deputies, one name stood out. A black man who spoke several native languages. A man who knew every trail, every tribe, and every outlaw hideout in Indian Territory. A man with a steady hand, a sharp eye, and an unbreakable sense of duty. That man was Bass Reeves. The idea of a former slave becoming a federal lawman shocked many people. But Parker didn't care about color. He cared about results, and Bass delivered. The U.S. Marshal Service swore him in as one of the first black deputy marshals west of the Mississippi River. Bass Reeves took the badge, not as a symbol of power, but of purpose. He had once been hunted. Now he would be the one doing the hunting, not for revenge, but for justice. His first missions were brutal. The Indian Territory was nearly lawless. Murderers, bandits, and escaped convicts hid deep in the wilderness. Each trip could last weeks or months. Deputies often left Fort Smith with a list of names and came back with bodies, or not at all. But Bass Reeves was fearless. His survival skills, learned from years in the wild, gave him an edge over every outlaw he faced. He could track a man for miles by a single broken branch or a faint trail of footprints. His memory was sharp. He could recall every face he saw and every path he rode. He also had something rare for a lawman of his time: honor. Bass never abused his authority, never took bribes, and never fired his weapon unless he had to. Even his enemies respected him. Word spread fast. The name Bass Reeves became a warning whispered across saloons and outlaw camps. If Bass Reeves is after you, it's already too late. From runaway slave to fearless lawman, Bass had come full circle. He once fled across these same plains, terrified and hunted. Now he rode them as a symbol of justice. The man who had once run from chains now wore a badge of steel. The hunted had become the hunter, and his legend was just beginning. When Bass Reeves pinned that silver badge to his chest, it was more than a job. It was destiny. The once enslaved man had become a deputy U.S. Marshal, sworn to uphold the law in one of the most dangerous regions in America, the Indian Territory. The territory was vast, nearly 75,000 square miles of open plains, forests, and rocky trails. It was filled with small towns, tribal lands, and outlaw hideouts. Murderers, thieves, and fugitives fled there to escape justice. Many believed no lawman would dare to follow them. They hadn't met Bass Reeves. Bass knew this land better than anyone. He had lived in it, hidden in it, and survived it. Now he was returning, not as prey, but as the hunter. On his first mission, Bass was given warrants for 2 outlaws wanted for robbery and murder. He set out from Fort Smith, Arkansas, armed with his Winchester rifle, a pair of Colt revolvers, and an unshakable sense of duty. Riding beside him was a Native American tracker who had worked with him before. Together they followed faint trails through dense woods, sleeping under the stars and cooking whatever they could hunt. Bass kept quiet most of the time, watching the land, studying tracks, reading signs others missed. After several days, they reached a small cabin hidden deep in the hills. The 2 fugitives were inside. Bass planned carefully. He wasn't the kind of man to rush in with guns blazing. He believed in patience and precision. When the sun rose, he walked calmly toward the cabin, rifle in hand. One outlaw stepped out to draw water from the well. Bass called out, "You're under arrest." The man froze, recognizing the calm authority in Bass's voice. His partner burst through the door, firing wildly. The bullets tore through the air, but Bass didn't flinch. He dropped to one knee, fired once, and struck the gunman's arm. Within moments, both men were disarmed and in handcuffs. That was Bass Reeves's first arrest as a U.S. Marshal. He brought them back to Fort Smith alive. Judge Isaac Parker looked over the report, nodded, and said, "Good work, Marshal Reeves." From that day forward, Bass had earned his place among the best. Word spread quickly. People began to talk about the tall, dark-skinned lawman who never missed his mark and never lost a prisoner. Some called him fearless. Others called him dangerous. To the outlaws, he was something else entirely. A nightmare. Bass's secret weapon was his discipline and creativity. He didn't rely only on his gun. He used disguises, strategy, and clever traps to outthink criminals. One famous story tells how Bass disguised himself as a homeless man to capture 2 wanted murderers. He wore ragged clothes, walked with a limp, and carried a broken cane. For 2 days he wandered near their hideout, pretending to be harmless. The outlaws laughed at him, even fed him scraps. They didn't realize the beggar was studying every move they made. When they let their guard down, Bass revealed his badge, pulled out his revolver, and said calmly, "Boys, you're under arrest." Neither man resisted. They knew escape was impossible. In another mission, Bass pretended to be a farmer looking for a place to settle. He rode into a gang's camp, shared food, and gained their trust. That night, while they slept, he tied their horses and waited. By morning, every outlaw was in chains. Bass Reeves became known not only for his marksmanship, but for his intelligence. He could remember every face he saw, even years later. He often carried warrants for dozens of men at once and never mixed up a name. But being a lawman in the Wild West was never easy. Each ride could mean death. Deputies were often ambushed or outnumbered. Bass faced gunfights, harsh weather, and betrayal. Yet he survived every mission. His calm under pressure made him seem almost superhuman. When people asked how he stayed alive so long, Bass would simply say, "I never shoot first. But I don't miss." He believed deeply in justice, but he also had compassion. He treated prisoners fairly, even offering food or water to those he captured. He didn't hate them, he pitied them. To him, justice wasn't about revenge. It was about doing what was right. As the months passed, his record grew. Outlaws who once roamed free began to whisper his name in fear. "Bass Reeves is coming," they would say. Some fled the territory the moment they heard he was on their trail. Even the toughest gunmen thought twice before facing him. One outlaw reportedly said, "If Reeves is after you, you'd better surrender or start digging your grave." Judge Parker admired him deeply. He called Bass one of his most reliable deputies. Reeves would often ride out with a handful of warrants and return weeks later with every name crossed off, every fugitive captured. Over time, his legend began to take shape. The newspapers called him the Law of the Indian Territory, but Bass never sought fame. He worked quietly, collecting his pay and moving on to the next case. His family rarely saw him. He spent most of his life in the saddle, crossing rivers, climbing mountains, and sleeping under open skies. The job demanded everything: courage, strength, and sacrifice. But Bass never complained. To him, it was more than duty. It was destiny. He once told a friend, "I was born a slave, but I'll die a free man, and no man will say I didn't do my job." By the late 1870s, Bass Reeves had become one of the most respected lawmen in the entire West. He was no longer just enforcing the law. He was the law, and as his legend grew, so did the danger. The criminals became bolder, the hunts longer, and the risks greater. But Bass Reeves didn't slow down. Every outlaw captured, every town made safer, was a reminder of how far he had come. The man who had once been treated as property now carried justice in his holster, and the next chapter of his story would make him a legend beyond the frontier. Bass Reeves was no longer just a deputy. He was a legend in the making. By the late 1870s, his name carried weight in every saloon, jailhouse, and outlaw camp from Arkansas to the Indian Territory. People told stories about him, how he could shoot a coin tossed in the air, how he once rode through a storm for 3 days to deliver a prisoner alive, how no man, no matter how dangerous, could outrun his justice. To the law-abiding, Bass Reeves was a hero. To criminals, he was a shadow, silent, unstoppable, and always watching. Bass took pride in doing his job right. Every mission began the same way. He would receive a stack of warrants from Fort Smith, each one carrying the name of a wanted man. Sometimes there were 10, sometimes 20. Then he'd pack his rifle, his 2 revolvers, his handcuffs, and his Bible. Before he rode out, he'd study every name carefully. He never forgot a face or a detail. He could remember a man's eyes, his voice, or even the way he walked. He once told a fellow deputy, "A man's trail always tells his story. You just have to know how to read it." And Bass could read trails better than anyone alive. One of his early cases that built his reputation was the capture of Jim Webb, a dangerous outlaw wanted for murder. Webb was fast with a gun, mean-tempered and proud. People said he'd never be taken alive. But Bass Reeves had other plans. For weeks he tracked Webb across rivers and woods, sleeping little and eating whatever he could find. When he finally caught up, Webb refused to surrender. He shouted insults, called Bass names, and reached for his gun. Bass fired first, 1 clean shot. When the smoke cleared, Webb was still alive but wounded. Reeves rushed in, disarmed him, and took him to jail. When the townsfolk saw Bass riding in with the feared killer handcuffed to his saddle, they couldn't believe it. News spread fast. Bass Reeves had captured Jim Webb alive. His courage wasn't just in his aim, it was in his heart. Bass never backed down, even when outnumbered. There was one time when 5 outlaws tried to ambush him in the open plains. They had rifles aimed and thought they had the upper hand. Bass calmly dismounted, knelt beside his horse, and fired quick, steady shots. When the gunfire stopped, 2 men were dead, 2 wounded, and 1 was running for his life. Bass caught him before sunset. He didn't boast about his victories. He didn't laugh or brag. He simply rode back with the men who had chosen the wrong side of the law. But Bass Reeves wasn't just a gunfighter. He was a man of deep faith and principle. He never drank alcohol, never cursed, and always carried his Bible on the trail. He often read from it to prisoners at night, telling them they still had a chance to change their lives. He believed justice wasn't about hate, it was about balance. One of his most famous sayings was, "Maybe the law ain't perfect, but it's the best we got, and I'm the best they got." Bass also became known for his creative disguises. He could pretend to be almost anyone, a cowboy, a farmer, a preacher, or a runaway outlaw. His disguises were so good that even other lawmen sometimes didn't recognize him. Once, he went after 2 dangerous brothers hiding deep in the woods. They were wanted for murder, and every attempt to arrest them had failed. Bass dressed as a poor beggar, with old clothes and a broken hat. He walked to their cabin, acting weak and tired. The brothers laughed and offered him food. For 2 days, Bass stayed near them, listening to their plans, waiting for the right moment. On the 3rd morning, he quietly pulled out his revolvers and said, "Boys, I've come for you." The brothers froze. They dropped their guns and surrendered without a fight. When Bass brought them into town, the sheriff asked how he managed it. Bass simply smiled and said, "They didn't expect the law to look hungry." Every outlaw capture added to his growing legend. People began calling him the invincible Marshal. He never lost a prisoner and rarely fired without reason. Even the outlaws who faced him alive respected him afterward. One man who spent years in prison later said, "I never met a fairer man than Bass Reeves. He didn't hate you. He just did his job." That was the power of Bass's name. It stood for justice that didn't bend. But the life of a lawman was lonely. Bass spent months away from his wife and children. He lived on the trail through storms, hunger, and danger. He missed family meals, holidays, and the laughter of his home. Still, he never quit. He saw his work as his duty, not only to the government, but to God. He believed he had been spared for a reason, to bring peace to a land torn by violence. By the mid-1880s, Bass Reeves had arrested hundreds of outlaws, and more than a few of them were men who had once owned slaves. It was poetic justice. The former slave now stood as the law itself. He didn't seek revenge. He simply upheld the law that had once denied him freedom. People began whispering something new, that maybe Bass Reeves was more than a man. Some said he could see in the dark, that bullets couldn't hit him, that he could appear and disappear at will. But Bass didn't care for myths. He just smiled, checked his saddle, and rode out again. There was always another name on his list, another outlaw to find. The legend of Bass Reeves was growing, and soon it would reach heights no one could imagine. The man who had once been born in chains was now rewriting what justice meant in the American West, and the world was finally beginning to notice. By the mid-1880s, the name Bass Reeves had become a warning whispered across the Wild West. Outlaws told each other, "If Reeves is coming, you better run or surrender." For more than 10 years, Bass had patrolled the Indian Territory, a vast wilderness filled with danger and death. He had hunted hundreds of fugitives, from horse thieves to cold-blooded killers. Yet, no matter how many he caught, there was always another name waiting on the next warrant. The lawless land never slept, and neither did Bass Reeves. Bass had developed a reputation for fearlessness. He could ride into the darkest corners of the frontier, where other marshals wouldn't dare go, and come back alive. He didn't brag about it. He simply saw it as his duty. His record was unmatched. Hundreds of outlaws arrested, dozens brought in from the deepest parts of the territory, and not a single prisoner ever escaped his custody. But his life wasn't just full of victories. It was full of danger, and every mission could have been his last. One story told across the frontier spoke of Bass Reeves versus the Brunter Gang, a group of heavily armed outlaws who had terrorized travelers for months. They ambushed wagons, robbed mail coaches, and killed anyone who resisted. Judge Isaac Parker himself sent Bass after them, trusting only him to bring them in. Bass set out alone, tracking the gang across rivers and canyons. For days he followed faint footprints, broken twigs, and the smell of campfire smoke. At night he slept in silence, listening for gunshots in the distance. Finally he found them. 6 men camped in a ravine, laughing and drinking by a fire. Bass waited until dawn. Then, with quiet steps, he rode down the slope and shouted, "Throw down your guns! I'm Deputy Marshal Reeves." For a moment there was silence. Then gunfire exploded. Bullets tore through the trees, but Bass was already moving. He fired with deadly precision, not wild, not rushed. When the smoke cleared, 2 men were dead, 3 wounded, and 1 was on his knees begging for mercy. Bass handcuffed the survivors and took them back to Fort Smith. When Judge Parker heard the report, he simply said, "You've done what no other man could." Despite his success, Bass never let power corrupt him. He treated every prisoner with fairness. He fed them, talked to them, and even prayed with them. Some of the men he captured later said Bass had saved their souls as well as their lives. He often told them, "You can start over. You can still do right." That kind of mercy was rare in the Wild West. But Bass believed true justice wasn't just punishment. It was redemption. Not everyone agreed with his methods. Some white marshals and sheriffs resented working with a black man who had earned more respect than they ever could. They whispered that he was lucky, that he'd soon be killed, that no ex-slave had any right to wear a badge. Bass ignored them. He didn't wear the badge for praise, he wore it for purpose. He had spent his childhood obeying orders. Now he lived to protect the law that once denied him. Bass's intelligence and calmness under pressure were legendary. He could plan an arrest like a chess match, thinking 10 moves ahead. In one famous case, he went after 2 killers hiding in the wilderness. Instead of rushing in, Bass posed as a cowhand and worked for nearby ranchers. He waited patiently, learning where the men would go, when they'd rest, and how they'd react. After a week, he walked right into their camp with a casual smile. They didn't suspect him. Then in a flash, his revolvers were out. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "the ride ends here." Both men were too stunned to draw. They surrendered on the spot. Sometimes his work tested his heart. He had to face men he once knew, neighbors, friends, and even relatives who'd fallen into crime. Each time, Bass stayed true to his duty. He never let personal feelings get in the way of the law. That kind of strength made him respected, but also feared. One outlaw once said, "Bass Reeves is like death. He always finds you." Bass's reputation grew so large that even children in the frontier towns knew his name. Parents would warn their sons, "If you don't behave, Bass Reeves will come for you." And they believed it. He had become something more than a man. He was a symbol, a living reminder that justice could come from anywhere, even from the hands of a man who had once been enslaved. But behind the legend, Bass was still human. Years of danger had worn him down. He missed his family and often worried about them. Still, he kept writing. He believed that if he stopped, more innocent people would suffer. He once said quietly to a fellow marshal, "The day I can't bring in a man alive is the day I hang up this badge." And he meant it. As the 1890s began, the Indian Territory was changing fast. New towns were forming, railroads were being built, and civilization was creeping into the wild frontier. But for every new town, there was still a band of thieves, killers, or fugitives hiding in the hills, and for each of them, there was only one name they truly feared: Bass Reeves. He had become the shadow of justice, the man who appeared when lawlessness took over, the one who could not be bribed, fooled, or frightened. Bass Reeves was no longer just enforcing the law. He was the law, and his greatest challenges were still to come. By the early 1890s, Bass Reeves had become a living legend. His badge shone brighter than ever. His name carried weight from Arkansas to Texas, and every outlaw in the Indian Territory feared the thought of facing him. But behind the legend was a man who carried heavy burdens. Years of hunting killers and thieves had taken their toll. He had seen death, betrayal, and pain. He had brought justice to others. But justice always came with a price. Bass Reeves was now in his 50s. He had served for nearly 20 years as a deputy U.S. Marshal, longer than most men could survive in that line of work. He had outlived gunfights, ambushes, and storms, but even he could not escape the weight of time and loss. His wife, Jenny, had grown tired of living in constant worry. Bass was gone for months at a time. He missed birthdays, holidays, and milestones. Their children barely knew the sound of his voice. He loved his family, but duty always came first. When he returned home, he brought gifts, small trinkets from distant towns, and stories of the road. But his eyes were tired, and the laughter that once filled his home had grown quiet. Jenny sometimes asked him to slow down, to rest. But Bass would simply shake his head and say, "If I stop, the devil wins." The work never stopped. More towns were forming, and with them came more crime. The Indian Territory was full of outlaws who believed they could outrun the law, until Bass Reeves showed up. He had captured so many criminals that people began to say he could smell guilt. And maybe in a way he could. He had spent so many years studying men, their habits, their lies, their eyes, that he could tell when someone's heart was hiding something dark. But even as he brought others to justice, tragedy was waiting for him at home. One night, Bass received a letter. It came from Muskogee, and the words inside cut deeper than any bullet ever could. The letter said that his own son, Benjamin Reeves, was wanted for murder. Benjamin had killed his wife in a moment of anger. The evidence was clear. There was no doubt. Bass sat silently as he read the words again and again. His hands shook. His heart ached. The lawman who had captured thousands of criminals now faced the hardest decision of his life. He could ignore the warrant. He could run, or he could do what he had done for every other man who broke the law. Bass Reeves made his choice. He polished his badge, loaded his gun, and mounted his horse. When his fellow marshals asked where he was going, he said quietly, "I'm going to bring in my boy." The ride to Muskogee was long and silent. Every hoofbeat sounded like a heartbeat in his chest. He thought of Benjamin as a child, his laughter, his first steps, the times they fished together when Bass was home. He remembered promising his son that he would always do what was right. Now, that promise was being tested in the most painful way possible. When Bass reached his son's house, Benjamin didn't resist. He stood in the doorway, tears in his eyes. He already knew why his father had come. "Pa," he said softly, "I didn't mean for it to happen." Bass nodded, his face calm but broken inside. "I know, son," he said, "but you know what I have to do." There was no shouting, no violence, no chase, just a father doing what his duty demanded. Bass Reeves arrested his own son and handed him over to the court. Benjamin was tried, convicted, and sent to prison. People all across the territory heard about it. Some said Bass was too cold, too strict, but others saw what it truly meant, that his sense of justice was stronger than blood. Judge Isaac Parker himself said, "There is no greater proof of integrity than what Bass Reeves has done." For the rest of his life, Bass rarely spoke about that day, but those who knew him said his eyes never looked the same afterward. He had brought peace to so many others, but he would never fully find peace for himself. Even after that tragedy, Bass continued his work. He said the only way to ease his pain was to keep serving the law. He kept riding the trails, arresting outlaws, and keeping the peace. When people asked him why he didn't retire, he simply replied, "As long as there's one man running from justice, I'll keep going." His faith kept him strong, but the loss of his wife soon followed. Jenny passed away quietly at home, and Bass buried her himself. He was alone now, a man with nothing but his horse, his badge, and the road ahead. By then, the Wild West was changing. The frontier was shrinking. Towns were growing. Railroads were cutting through the land, and the sound of gunfire was slowly fading. But there were still shadows where lawlessness lived. And whenever darkness appeared, Bass Reeves rode into it, steady, silent, and unbroken. He had lost family, friends, and peace. Yet he never lost his purpose, because Bass Reeves wasn't just chasing outlaws anymore. He was chasing redemption, for himself and for a world that had once enslaved him. Bass Reeves had seen it all, the blood, the fear, the pain, and the price of justice. He had buried his wife, arrested his own son, and watched friends fall in the line of duty. But through it all, one thing never changed. Bass Reeves could not be broken. By the late 1890s, people called him the Invincible Marshal. He had survived more gunfights than any man in the territory. He had ridden through ambushes, storms, and traps set by the deadliest criminals in the West. Yet somehow, he always came back alive. Some said luck kept him alive. Others said faith. But Bass Reeves believed it was something else. Purpose. For Bass, danger was a part of life. Every time he left Fort Smith or Muskogee, he knew it could be his last ride. He would look down at his silver badge, whisper a quiet prayer, and say, "Lord, guide my hand. Let me do right." Then he'd mount his horse and disappear into the wild. The Indian Territory was still crawling with criminals, train robbers, cattle thieves, and killers who had no fear of death. But they feared Bass Reeves. He had earned a reputation that few dared to challenge. Still, some outlaws thought they could outsmart or outgun him. They all failed. One of the most famous stories from this time was the case of Jim Lee, a notorious outlaw and expert gunfighter. Lee had sworn he would never be taken alive. He was fast with a pistol and known to shoot without hesitation. When Bass received the warrant, he studied it carefully. He knew that catching Lee meant walking into a trap. But Bass never refused a job. He tracked Lee for days across rocky trails and deep forests until he found his hideout, a small shack hidden behind a grove of trees. Bass approached quietly, watching smoke rise from the chimney. He called out, Jim Lee. I'm a U.S. Marshal. Come out with your hands up. No reply. Seconds later, a gunshot exploded through the air. The bullet whistled past Bass's head, grazing his hat. He didn't flinch. He dove behind a tree, steadied his rifle, and waited. Jim Lee fired again, then a third time. The outlaw laughed, shouting, "You'll never take me, Reeves." Bass waited patiently, counting each shot. When Lee paused to reload, Bass moved fast, stepped from behind the tree, took aim, and fired once. Lee fell instantly. When Bass checked his body, he saw that the outlaw's hand was still gripping his gun. Bass whispered, "You should have surrendered." After that day, the legend of Bass Reeves grew even larger. People began saying he could not be killed by a bullet, that he was protected by something greater than luck. Another time, a gang of 3 men tried to ambush him at night. They hid behind rocks near a river crossing, waiting for him to ride through. But Bass had a sixth sense for danger. He stopped his horse before reaching the water and looked around. He spotted the reflection of moonlight on a rifle barrel. Without hesitation, he jumped from his horse and rolled into the grass. Gunfire erupted, echoing through the night. When it was over, 2 men were dead, and the third lay wounded. Bass dragged the survivor to Fort Smith himself. When asked how he knew they were there, Bass simply said, "The night always tells you something, if you listen." He became known for his calm under fire. Where others panicked, Bass stayed steady. He never shot wildly. Every bullet he fired had a purpose. Once a young deputy asked him how he managed to stay so calm. Bass replied, "Fear comes to every man. The trick is to keep it from showing." That advice saved many lives over the years, but even the bravest man carries scars. Bass had been shot at, ambushed, and hunted. He had lost friends, other marshals who didn't make it back from their missions. He would attend their funerals, standing silently by their graves, hat in hand. When people asked him how he kept going, he said, "Because if I don't, who will?" His strength came from his belief that the law had to mean something, even in a land where chaos ruled. He had lived as a slave in a world where men could do whatever they pleased. Now he made sure no one ever felt that kind of powerlessness again. His reputation reached Washington. D.C. reports of his bravery were sent to federal offices, describing him as one of the finest marshals in American history. But Bass never cared about fame or medals. He once told a preacher, "I only want the Lord to know I did my duty." By the turn of the century, Bass Reeves had arrested more than 3,000 outlaws. He had faced every kind of criminal, white, black, rich, poor, and treated them all the same. He never let anger or revenge cloud his judgment. To some, he was justice itself, cold, fair, and unyielding. To others, he was a ghost, the man they couldn't kill. Yet deep inside, Bass knew his time on the frontier was coming to an end. The wild lands were changing. Railroads stretched across the plains. Courthouses replaced campfires. The era of gunfights and posses was fading into memory. But as long as one outlaw still breathed in defiance of the law, Bass Reeves would not hang up his badge. He had been born in bondage, lived through war, and brought justice to a land that had none. And though his hair had turned gray and his hands were scarred, his fire still burned. The man they couldn't kill, the lawman who feared nothing, was still in the saddle, and he wasn't done yet. The dawn of the new century brought change to the Wild West. Railroads stretched across the plains. Towns rose where forests once stood, and law and order began to take hold. The gunfights and dusty trails that had once defined the frontier were slowly fading into history. But one man refused to fade with them. Even as his hair turned white and his hands showed the marks of age, Bass Reeves still rode with his badge shining proudly on his chest. He had been a deputy U.S. Marshal for more than 30 years, longer than most men could survive in such a dangerous job. And though the world around him was changing, one thing had not changed. Crime still existed, and Bass still believed it was his duty to fight it. The younger deputies admired him like a living legend. They had grown up hearing stories about the man who never missed a shot, who captured 3,000 criminals, and who could outsmart any outlaw alive. To them, he was almost superhuman, but Bass always reminded them that he was just a man doing his duty. He told the young marshals, "Don't look at me like I'm something special. The badge don't make you better, it just makes you responsible." Those words stuck with them for life. By now, Bass's face was lined with years of dust and sun. He had buried friends, faced death countless times, and lost almost everything that mattered to him personally. But his spirit remained unbroken. He continued to patrol the Indian Territory, now part of the newly forming Oklahoma Territory. It was no longer as wild as it once was, but the job was still dangerous. Old outlaws still roamed the hills, and Bass refused to rest while injustice existed. In 1907, everything changed. Oklahoma officially became a state, and with that, the U.S. Marshals lost their jurisdiction over much of the area. The frontier days of federal lawmen were over. Bass Reeves, after more than 3 decades of service, was forced to retire from the Marshal service. For the first time in his life, Bass had no warrant in his pocket, no outlaw to chase, no trail to follow. The silence felt heavy. He had lived his entire life in motion, from a runaway slave to a frontier lawman, and now he was told to stop. At 69 years old, Bass hung up his badge. But retirement didn't suit him. Not long after, the city of Muskogee, Oklahoma, offered him a position as a police officer. Bass accepted without hesitation. He traded his wide frontier for city streets, his horse for patrol boots, but his sense of duty stayed the same. He patrolled his beat with the same discipline he had carried all his life. Even in his old age, criminals feared him. When word spread that Bass Reeves was now walking the streets of Muskogee, the city's crime rate dropped almost overnight. One young officer who worked beside him said, "Even the toughest men respected him." Nobody wanted to test Bass Reeves. Bass never fired his weapon again as a city officer. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough. He lived modestly, spending his evenings in quiet reflection. Sometimes he visited the courthouse, sitting on the steps and watching the people pass by. Families, shopkeepers, young boys playing in the dust. He had helped build this peace, though few knew it. To many of the new generation, he was just an old man in a worn hat. They didn't realize they were walking past one of the greatest lawmen in American history, a man who had done more for justice than any dime novel hero ever had. As the years passed, Bass's health began to decline. He had outlived his era. The Old West was gone, replaced by trains, telegraphs, and motor cars. But he never complained. He would smile and say, "The world's changing fast. Maybe that's a good thing." He still kept his badge polished and his guns clean, though he never needed them again. To him, they weren't symbols of power, but of principle. They reminded him of what he stood for: fairness, courage, and honor. In his final year, he was diagnosed with Bright's disease, a kidney illness that slowly weakened his body. Still, he refused to rest. He worked for the Muskogee Police Department until he physically couldn't walk his rounds anymore. Even in sickness, Bass held his head high. When friends asked how he wanted to be remembered, he said, "Just as a man who did his duty." On January 12, 1910, Bass Reeves passed away peacefully at his home in Muskogee. He was 71 years old. The news spread slowly, but those who knew him mourned deeply. Judge Parker, long since gone, had once called him the best deputy he ever had, and history would prove him right. Bass Reeves had been born into slavery, lived through war, and spent his life chasing justice across the frontier. He had turned the impossible into reality, from chains to a badge, from being hunted to being the hunter. He was the final echo of the true Wild West, a man who lived and died with honor. After his death, stories of his bravery began to fade into legend. But those who studied history would later uncover his truth, that this man, once a slave, might have been the inspiration behind the Lone Ranger. He was the mask of justice before there were movies, the real hero behind the myth, and though time moved on, one truth remained. Bass Reeves was not just a lawman, he was justice itself. When Bass Reeves died in 1910, the world moved on quickly. The Wild West that had once roared with gunfire and dust was now quiet. The railroads had tamed the frontier and new cities rose where wilderness once stood. The age of the cowboy, the outlaw, and the frontier marshal had ended. For a time, Bass Reeves's name was nearly forgotten. His story, as great as it was, disappeared into the shadows of history. There were no movies about him, no songs, no statues. He had lived his life as a hero, but history wasn't kind to men who looked like him. Yet legends never truly die. Years later, Historians began to uncover the truth about the man who had once brought order to chaos. They found dusty reports and faded arrest records. They saw the same name appear again and again, Bass Reeves. Each report told the same story, a lawman who had arrested thousands, who had never taken a bribe, who had treated every man fairly. As they pieced his life together, a picture began to form, not just of a great marshal, but of one of the greatest heroes of the American frontier. People began to realize how extraordinary his journey had been. He had been born a slave without a name of his own, and had become one of the first black deputy U.S. marshals west of the Mississippi River. He had ridden more miles and faced more danger than almost any lawman in history. He had survived ambushes, captured over 3,000 criminals, and done it all with dignity, courage, and faith. He never abused his power. He never used his gun unless he had no choice. He never let hate guide his hand, in a time when the world judged men by the color of their skin. Bass Reeves proved that character, not color, defined a man's worth. As stories of the Old West were turned into books, plays, and early films, one mystery began to grow. The legend of the Lone Ranger, the masked hero who rode a white horse, had a Native American partner and brought justice to the frontier. For decades, people thought the Lone Ranger was pure fiction, but then historians noticed something strange. The details of Bass Reeves's life matched the legend almost perfectly. Both men wore disguises, worked closely with native partners, rode white horses, captured criminals without corruption, believed deeply in justice. It couldn't be coincidence. More and more people began to believe that Bass Reeves was the true inspiration for the Lone Ranger. If that was true, then the world's most famous cowboy hero had been based on a man who had once been enslaved, a man of color, a man of honor, a man history had nearly erased. As the truth spread, the name Bass Reeves began to shine again. Writers, filmmakers, and educators started telling his story to a new generation. Schools began to include him in their lessons about American history. Books were written, and statues were raised in his honor. In Fort Smith, Arkansas, a massive bronze statue of Bass Reeves now stands tall, facing the old courthouse where Judge Isaac Parker once ruled. The lawman stands beside his horse, hat in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if still watching over the land he once protected. Visitors come from all over the world to see it. They look up at the statue and read the words carved below his name: the most feared U.S. Marshal in the Indian Territory. For many, that statue is more than a monument. It's a reminder of what justice truly means. Bass Reeves's legacy also lives on in modern culture. His story has been told in documentaries, books, and television shows. In 2019, the movie Hell on the Border brought his legend to the screen. And in 2023, the Paramount Plus series Lawman Bass Reeves introduced his life to millions of viewers around the world. Finally, his name was being spoken with the respect it deserved. Today, Bass Reeves is remembered as a pioneer of law enforcement, a trailblazer for black officers, and a symbol of moral strength. His life reminds people that greatness is not given. It's earned through courage, sacrifice, and integrity. He once said, "Maybe the law ain't perfect, but it's the best we got." And through that imperfect law, Bass brought justice to thousands and peace to a land that had known only chaos. Even now, more than a century later, his story continues to inspire. He represents every person who was told they couldn't rise, who was told they didn't belong, who refused to believe it. He showed that no matter where you start, you can become the hero of your own story. As the sun sets over the bronze statue in Fort Smith, the shadow it casts stretches long, just like his legacy. The slave who became a marshal, the hunted who became the hunter, the man who became the law. Bass Reeves, the real legend of the American West. Time moves on, but legends never die. More than a century after his death, the name Bass Reeves still rides through history, a symbol of courage, justice, and the unstoppable human spirit. The dust of the Old West has long settled. The gunfights are gone, the trails are paved, and the world is far more civilized than it was in his day. But the story of Bass Reeves still speaks to people because his life was never just about catching outlaws. It was about standing for what was right, even when the world said he couldn't. Bass Reeves was born into chains, yet he never let those chains define him. He escaped slavery not only with his feet, but with his soul. He learned that real freedom is not just living without bondage, it is living with purpose. When he put on that badge, he didn't just enforce the law, he became the law. He carried justice on his shoulders through some of the most lawless lands in America, never once bending under the weight. He could have given in to bitterness. He could have turned away from a country that once denied his humanity. But instead he chose honor. He chose duty. He chose to rise higher than hate. Historians say that Bass Reeves arrested more than 3,000 criminals, killed at least 14 men in self-defense, and never once abused his power. He treated every prisoner, white or black, rich or poor, and with the same fairness. He spoke with respect, he acted with integrity, and he always carried his Bible. In an age of chaos, he was calm. In a time of prejudice, he was just. In a world of violence, he was mercy. That is why people today still look to Bass Reeves, not just as a man of the West, but as a symbol of justice for all times. Modern law enforcement agencies honor him as one of their founding heroes. The U.S. Marshal Service now includes Bass Reeves in its official Hall of Fame. His image appears in museums, history books, and police academies as a model of integrity and courage. Every new deputy who pins on a badge is told his story, the story of a man who served the law when it wasn't made to protect him. But his influence doesn't stop there. Across America, artists, writers, and filmmakers are telling his story to new generations. His name appears in classrooms, his likeness in murals, and his voice echoes in documentaries and films. Children learn about him not just as a marshal, but as a role model of perseverance. He teaches that justice is not about skin color, power, or wealth. It's about standing firm when doing right is hard. In Fort Smith, Arkansas, where his legend began, people still visit the statue of Bass Reeves. Some come out of curiosity, others come in silence, standing before the bronze lawman who once rode the frontier. Tour guides tell stories of his bravery, his disguises, his gunfights, and his wisdom. Parents tell their children, that man was real. He fought for what was right when no one else would, and as the sun sets, the statue seems alive, standing tall facing west, watching over the land he once protected. But Bass Reeves's legacy is more than a monument. It's a message. It reminds the world that true greatness doesn't come from fame or fortune. It comes from the choices we make when no one is watching. Bass didn't seek glory. He didn't ask to be remembered. He simply believed in doing his job the right way. Every single day, that belief made him immortal. Today, when people talk about heroes, they often mention names from books, movies, and comic pages. Superman, Batman, the Lone Ranger. But long before any of them, there was Bass Reeves, the real man who stood for truth and justice without needing a mask or a cape. He didn't need a legend written for him. He lived it. He showed that courage doesn't mean fearlessness. It means doing what's right even when you're afraid. He showed that justice isn't a word, it's a promise. And he proved that one man, born with nothing, could still change everything. Bass Reeves's life continues to inspire dreamers, fighters, and believers. From police academies to classrooms, from historians to storytellers, his spirit rides on. Each time someone stands up for what's right, refuses to give up, or fights for fairness, that's Bass Reeves living again through them. He once said, "The law may not be perfect, but it's the best we've got." And through his strength, he made it better. When people look back on his story now, they see more than a lawman. They see the reflection of what America could be. Brave, fair, and unyielding. Bass Reeves began his life in bondage and ended it in legend. He was a symbol of what one person can become when they refuse to be broken. He was more than a hero of the Wild West. He was, and always will be, the immortal face of justice.